Good day to everyone joining us and welcome to today's X-Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Centered on Sites, Committing to a Collaborative Approach for Rare Disease Clinical Trial Success. My name is Mira and I'll be your X-Talks host for today. Today's webinar will run for approximately 60 minutes. This presentation includes a Q&A session with our speakers. This webinar is designed to be interactive and webinars work best when you're involved. So please feel free to submit questions and comments for our speakers throughout the presentation using the questions chat box. And we'll try to attend to your questions during the Q&A session. This chat box is located in the control panel on the right-hand side of your screen. If you require any assistance, please contact me at any time by sending a message using this chat panel. At this time, all participants are in listen-only mode. Please note that this event will be recorded and made available for streaming on xtalks.com. At this point, I'd like to thank Medpace who developed the content for this presentation. Medpace is a scientifically driven global full-service clinical contract research organization providing phase 1 to 4 clinical development services to the biotechnology, pharmaceutical, and medical device industries. Medpace's mission is to accelerate the global development of safe and effective medical therapeutics through its high science and disciplined operating approach that leverages regulatory and therapeutic expertise across all major areas, including oncology, cardiology, metabolic disease, endocrinology, central nervous system, and antiviral anti-infective. Headquartered in Cincinnati, Ohio, Medpace employs approximately 3,600 people across 39 countries as of December 31st, 2020. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's event. Dr. Moore is a board-certified acute care pediatric nurse practitioner with more than 10 years of clinical experience in the acute care setting at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. As a provider, Ms. Moore's clinical focus was within pediatric rare disease, congenital heart disease, and critical care. Since leaving the bedside, her clinical trial experience has remained focused on indications within rare disease, cardiology, and pediatrics. Moore leverages her clinical expertise to support both medical and operational aspects of clinical trial conduct. This includes safety surveillance and signal detection activities, providing study team and site training, and application of her practical knowledge of patient populations to support feasibility, recruitment and retention, and the development of study materials. Next, we've got Kelly Milhame, is an experienced clinical trial manager with over 12 years of experience in clinical research. She has overseen multiple global trials, and her experience includes management of trials in cardiovascular, neuromuscular, metabolic, hepatic, and endocrine indications with a special focus on rare or orphan diseases and pediatrics. Her past experience as a global lead CRA in complex indications allows her special insight in implementing optimized high-quality monitoring strategy. Last but not least, we've got Dr. Jones, who's a consultant in pediatric inherited metabolic diseases at WOLMAN unit at St. Mary's Hospital. His major research interest is therapy in lysosomal storage diseases. Since 2008, he has been a consultant in pediatric inherited metabolic diseases at WOLMAN unit and is now the clinical lead for the LSD service. He is currently the principal investigator in a number of LSD trials and a senior lecturer at the University of Manchester. Dr. Jones is now the medical director of the NIHR Manchester Children's Clinical Research Facility, and he is an author of over 200 peer-reviewed papers and 4 book chapters. And now, without further ado, I'd like to hand the mic over to our speakers. They may begin when ready.
Thanks, Mira, and hello to all of you listening out there today. On behalf of the panel, I welcome you to our discussion, which will focus on strategies to foster a collaborative partnership with clinical research sites in rare disease. And in the spirit of this collaboration, Simon, Kelly, and I will speak to the agenda before you from our varied points of view as a clinician, a site PI, and as an operational lead within a CRO. So to begin, the reason we are here. As someone who spent my entire clinical career within pediatric and rare disease indications, I am admittedly a bit biased. That said, I truly believe that those of us working within this space as clinicians and researchers are champions for patients and families, resolute in our shared goal to improve the lives of those living with rare disease. Encompassing over 7,000 diseases and affecting over 300 million persons worldwide, the prevalence of rare disease is anything but rare. Despite this meet of many, the study of rare disease is inherently challenging in a heterogeneous population where patients can be few and far between. So, as we center on sites today and discuss logistical and operational strategies that support successful outcomes in rare research, we must remember that the goal of collaborations between industry, sites, and patients is to find new treatments that alleviate suffering, to provide a deeper understanding of disease natural history, and to offer hope and empowerment to patients and families who may sometimes feel alone and without a voice as they search for answers. And although I am currently removed from direct patient care and within a CRO environment, I still remember the faces of those I managed throughout the years and take their stories to share with you now as a reminder of why we are here. The business of research involves multiple stakeholders with varied interests that must find ways to form alliances that foster successful collaborative partnerships between site and CRO. This is particularly true in vulnerable populations such as those with rare disease, where it is essential that the mission of the industry partner aligns with the passion and dedication of sites and the patients and families in their care. Additionally, given the difficult and sometimes unknown reality of the diagnosis and ongoing management of rare disease, patients and sites are owed open and transparent communication from the CRO regarding study design, procedures and challenges, as well as timely updates throughout the life of the trial. Common strategies in trials that promote communication, such as CRCPI calls, can be taken to the next level in rare disease. For example, a pediatric rare trial for which I was involved was struggling with recruitment. To get a sense of the recruitment challenges from the site level, I conducted individual site calls with CRCs and PIs. And then leveraging my years of experience at the bedside within the targeted clinical environments, I was able to really connect with the sites and to draw out barriers and mitigation strategies site by site. I then collated and presented this feedback along with the support of several CRC site champions at a combined site call. These champions are my boots on the ground, if you will, at each of these sites that I can count on to really tell me like it is and to partner with our CRO team to facilitate successful trial conduct. This open form of communication with the sites provided invaluable data that revealed clear trends and opportunities to improve recruitment methods and tools. I found that sites appreciate the CRO's ability to be agile and adaptive, particularly during challenges that will always arise, and to effectively distribute information in tangible, consistent manners that supports and facilitates the efficient conduct of study. And to this idea of consistent support to the sites, although the concept is important in any clinical trial, I would suggest that in rare disease, the CRO's ability to offer committed team members that are trained within therapeutic space is even more relevant. Mirroring clinical practice where patients may be with the same team of care providers throughout the course of their life, having reliable CRO team members such as CRAs as that extension of the study site team can help alleviate site burden, create efficiencies, and instill trust. And finally, the acknowledgement of social disparities. We cannot ignore or underestimate the impact of social determinants of health in clinical research, specifically in rare, where the complexities of the diseases, along with their close relation to disability, widen this gap even further. CROs involved in rare research are already addressing such disparities through increasing scientific knowledge, encouraging multidisciplinary healthcare, and the advancement of treatment options. That said, at the site and patient levels, the CRO must also partner with stakeholders to truly understand patient barriers and to ensure patients have individualized support to participate in trials, be it through the usual gas and meal cards and covering of travel costs to the more unique such as utilization of decentralized or hybrid trial designs, or the use of remote technologies that lessen the burden and exposure for the most vulnerable and/or frail of our patients. To further promote site partnerships, engagement should be early in the study process. Often, industry partners' first meaningful contact with the sites is during feasibility, when the protocol may be final or near final, and study documents such as the ICF and site materials are already in development. I suggest that this is way too late and a missed opportunity to bring in the site to these discussions. Unlike the cut and stamp approach that can sometimes be applied to research in highly investigated indications, rare disease has no stamp. We do not know what we do not know. It therefore makes sense to leverage the expertise of key opinion leaders, experienced sites, and patients living with the disease to develop protocols that proactively mitigate the unknown. This approach can minimize the need for costly and time-consuming amendments, but importantly, provides a protocol from the start that is feasible and palatable to sites and participants, thus improving recruitment and retention. Again, patients are at the center of rare disease research and one of the primary stakeholders in either the success or failure of a trial. So to foster mutual respect between researchers and patients, assumptions applied to those with rare disease must be avoided. And as to this patient-centered approach, the use of patient workshops, focus groups, and interviews early in study development has emerged as an evidence-based approach to adapt study design through the lived experience. Patients and their families are quite aware of what works and what doesn't. We all know that. This insight can be quite specific, such as recommendations on procedural equipment that works best, or even simply how to draw blood samples. This in turn supports accurate data collection, along with the safety and comfort of our participants. And to pediatric populations, where my heart lies, they are closely tied to rare indications, an approach that acknowledges the inherent differences in adults versus children and adolescents is needed. For example, in a pediatric rare study I was involved in, the sites were really struggling to consent parents of infants with epidermolysis bullosa, a genetic, disabling, and sometimes fatal skin disorder characterized by blistering formation on the skin and mucosal areas of the body. And as a nurse that had cared for many patients within the Center of Excellence for EB Management, I knew firsthand the fear, guilt, and desperation that families can have when their child is born with EB. But I also understood that these parents were warriors, and they were going to be our best resource on how to mitigate the issue. So we asked the sites to speak to their families about barriers that are occurring during the consenting process. What we learned was that parents, particularly those living with EB themselves, had associated trauma and fear surrounding the clinical research process and didn't want their child to be perceived as a guinea pig. That's the word we heard over and over again. They also wanted us to have assurances that the procedures associated with the study would not cause additional pain in an already painful indication or exacerbation of the disease. We also learned that parents were not saying no to research. They were saying, I'm scared and I need more information. So to mitigate, we developed patient materials that provided to them information in the identified areas of concern. A pamphlet that described in layman's terms what is clinical research, something we may have taken a little bit for granted, as well as a patient journey handout that outlined the schedule of events and procedures for the study. We also created a video with a parent that had participated in the trial with her infant to give a firsthand testimony, if you will, to prospective families on her experience. Additionally, I spoke to each PI and discussed strategies for successful content, which is more of an art than a science, particularly in pediatric populations. This included providing the PIs additional information on the safety profile of the study drug that could then be shared with parents to help alleviate some of those fears of the unknown. It also included process-oriented shifts in the study to accommodate bundling of procedures such as lab draws. I knew the NICU environment, so we were able to really hone in on those procedures and pair them with standard of care activities, as well as using the child life services that are in the academic centers to engage the siblings and to support the baby and parents during procedures. And as for logistical considerations, I will leave that to Kelly a little bit later on for details. But as discussed earlier, sites are really more willing to be involved with studies that support their patients and site resources. This may include the use of specialized vendors to accommodate remote procedures, home health resources and monitoring, as well as those that facilitate travel and access to care. So with regard to protocol optimization, we need to align with the needs of the patient population under investigation and to, again, leverage that lived experience of both the site and the patient and their families to develop a well-designed trial. And several questions will help guide those endeavors, starting with the endpoints. Are they relevant and meaningful? And more importantly, is the research question taking into account the perspective and needs of the patient? Are the eligibility criteria feasible, realistic, and clear, or are they restrictive and vague? Do they truly reflect the diversity of the population that may use the investigational product? And has the procedural burden been minimized? It is important to review the schedule of events, not only from the operational feasibility perspective, but also from that of the patient. I think we have all reviewed protocols that no actual human could possibly endure, let alone individuals with life-threatening disease. In fact, one of the first things I do when I review a protocol is pull out a blank calendar and map out the schedule of events. Although the sponsor may want as much data as possible, this may not be reasonable or necessary. Seeing it through the eyes of the patient and family, either figuratively or literally, is key, in my opinion. Early collaboration with patients, families, and sites to review and provide feedback regarding study procedures help to mitigate these barriers to sites and promote recruitment and retention of patients. And finally, is data collection limited to only that which is essential to evaluate endpoints? For sites, the input of study data into complicated and endless ECRS is a time-consuming and sometimes frustrating activity. For patients, they are providing to us their very DNA. The avoidance of quote-unquote data mining, if you will, and unnecessary data collection really respects the sacrifices and work of both patients and sites. And to the role of patient advocacy groups in clinical research, it has evolved well beyond a singular focus on recruitment activities. The voices of those with rare disease are now being heard through the work of hundreds and hundreds of grassroots and national patient advocacy groups who contribute in multiple ways, including the influencing of research funding, the provision of participant databases, as well as needed legitimacy and buy-in to prospective treatments or trials through rare disease communication pathways. And finally, although we understand the importance of dissemination of study findings from the scientific or perspective of the researcher, we cannot underestimate the impact of data and knowledge to those living with rare disease. As we know, with some indications affecting only a handful of individuals, sometimes a world apart from each other, the ability of patient advocacy groups to support the communication of results to patients is essential. So now I am very happy to hand off to Simon for his insights and lessons learned from the site perspective. Simon?
Thank you. I hope you all hear me okay. So as you've heard, I'm a paediatrician from Manchester in the UK, and more than half of my work is in clinical trials in my area of disease, so rare genetic disorders of childhood. I've also done a little bit of adult work, again in the rare disease area, so I've over 15 odd years I've learned through a number of different types of trial a lot, and I think our team here has learned a lot, and certainly it's one of the most satisfying parts of my job. So I'll start perhaps not as we're advised to do, but with the problems. I think we're always supposed to have this in the middle, aren't we? But let's think about what challenges there are for doing clinical trials properly in rare diseases. So we don't want rare diseases to be simply an excuse for doing trials badly. We want to do the best possible trials in rare diseases. We owe that to our patients. But there are some real problems with this. So we often see, as we've heard, small numbers of very heterogeneous population, very heterogeneous patients. Sometimes there's some very poorly characterized diseases. Now, you know, if you're doing a trial in Duchenne muscular dystrophy or cystic fibrosis, then those are rarer genetic diseases that are very well characterized with multiple trials. But we've done a number of trials in the last few years where there's never been a trial for that disease area or that group of patients before. And so that means the natural history may be unknown, and the choice of endpoints that is the best to both show benefit and to serve as regulatory endpoints is unknown and are often guesses early on when we're writing the protocols. We always struggle when designing these trials when we think about do we have multiple sites for these very rare indications so that everyone with this particular disease will have a site near them, meaning of course that each site maybe only has one patient, or do you have a very small number of sites and accept that the patients will have to travel? Of course, these are patients who are either acutely unwell or very chronically unwell with significant complex needs, and so travel can be a real problem. We've also run a number of studies where patients have had to relocate for the first phase of the study, be that 3 or 6 months. And of course, the impact of that on families can be huge. We're also dealing often, and in my area, when we're thinking about neurodegenerative disorders in childhood, are dealing with children who have cognitive impairments and or behavioral difficulties. So both traveling can be challenging, as well as even very simple clinical assessments and endpoint assessments. So we need to bear all of these in mind when we're thinking of how we create the rare disease trial that will actually answer our questions, as well as having a rare disease environment for our patients and researchers. And of course, for me as a pediatrician, the majority of the subjects in my trials are children. Now, not all rare disease trials involve children, and I think that's a really important statement. We shouldn't forget the adults with rare diseases. But probably the majority of rare disease trials involve children in some way. And so that clearly creates what we think of as a vulnerable population. And you know, we're always advised in life never to work with animals and children, and that almost has defined my research career, which is essentially working with animals and children. So I can bear testimony to the challenges of that, but also the joy of that, and I really wouldn't do anything else. Next slide, please. So what are the solutions? Let's move to how we've managed to try and manage these. Well, in rare diseases, clinical trials are normally carried out not in trial centers or phase 1 units, which are designed purely about clinical trials, but often in the clinical centers of excellence, which have developed for often bizarre historical reasons, looking after patients with these rare diseases. And so you have often a multidisciplinary team in that center who are very used to managing these patients and understand the patients and have already got relationships with many of the patients who might be subjects, but also the patient advocacy groups. And so you've got a very good and often quite unique team that you're working with from the very start. But really the solutions can only come, as we've heard before, with true partnership. And that will involve the CRO in the study. That will involve often the pharmaceutical company. And we do a lot of work with some early phase biotechnology companies on the design of the protocols, the selection of patients in terms of inclusion-exclusion criteria to make sure that we're involved from the very start with the idea behind the treatment, then the design of the clinical trial, working with the CRO about how we can implement the trial, but also having as partners in this both patients, families, and the patient organizations, as well as individuals like me in the academic centers. And this, I think, is so important. And in fact, we've taken this on occasion even a step further. And one of our patient organizations in the UK has formed a commercial arm which manages the logistics for a number of our clinical trials. And so the patients are, or the patients travel, the families travel to the trial site is organized by individuals who've worked in the patient organization environment, who understand the particular needs of individuals with that disease. And for example, if the patients are usually using a wheelchair, that we don't put them up in a hotel near the hospital, that actually where the doors are too narrow for the wheelchair to get in. And we've certainly seen that before. So really basic, simple things. If, in my experience, the patients don't complain to me about the trial in the hospital, they complain about the little things. They complain about the travel, what the hotel accommodation is like, all of these small things that actually are really important in making the entire experience as reasonable as possible. So all of this requires an open, multidisciplinary and collaborative approach where we all recognize that we all bring something to the table, we all have our individual areas of expertise, and we all have to rely on each other to do the best job possible. And in my experience, actually this is, well, yeah, this is all really difficult and much more challenging than many trials and more common indications, but actually the massively motivated patient and family groups make this really challenging area possible to do research in, but also really enjoyable and rewarding. Next slide, please. So I'll talk a little bit about what we've done in Manchester here in the UK. You know, we're a sort of medium-sized city in the UK, which is relatively industrial and has significant areas of economic deprivation around the city. But we have a large patient population driven by a very centralized care model, and we've taken care over decades now to try and describe and define our patients with rare diseases as well as we can. We think that that's useful in terms of delivering good clinical care, even where there's no underlying treatment for the disease, but good supportive care. And building up that experience with the patients has meant that we often are where companies have come, in part to companies have often come here because we had lots of patients and it was easier to recruit. But I think that over time this has changed because we've shown that we can deliver effective and good quality trials. And so even when we don't have a large cohort of patients, we've seen companies come here simply because they know that we can all work together to provide a good outcome. So I think when sites and individuals and different centres come to me to say, how could we start doing more research? We've got patient groups, we'd like to be involved, we're enthusiastic. We often tell them about our journey. We've tried to deliver some of the trials in the early days really well to try and build a reputation for good quality work. And we've also built up over time a good research infrastructure and an experienced team. So we have a dedicated clinical research facility within the centre of the Children's Hospital here in Manchester, the same floor as the intensive care unit, the children's intensive care unit, etc. But which has a relaxed and very informal environment, so the kids and the families like it. They come to us often for a number of years, and so everyone becomes part of the family in many ways. We also try and make sure that research is built into an integral part of good clinical care. And so the value of working with families, even where there is no therapy, in writing up case series and defining the natural history of the disease, is that actually families get, with many of these chronic conditions, get used to research. And I was really interested to hear some of the discussions earlier on about EB and some of the fear that families have around clinical trials. And I've certainly heard the guinea pig words on a number of occasions. But we find where families are more experienced in research, where they're used to giving blood samples for omic studies, and some of these non-interventional trials, that when we come then to moving forward with a trial that's actually a CTIMP or an ATIMP, an interventional trial, that the families are well versed in information sheets and consent forms, and are versed with overall trial structure and how research works. And the fear then is reduced, not gone, but reduced. So I think from our perspective as a rare disease centre looking after lots of rare disease patients, we feel that research is an integral part of what we do. And if we didn't do research, we wouldn't be offering the best care to our patients. And so we've built an academic and clinical research groups out of purely clinical groups to try and answer these questions that our patients keep asking us, and they are the motivation. Next slide, please. I'll talk quickly through the range of studies. I wanted to talk briefly about some of the studies we've done in lysosomal storage diseases. I'm wary of talking for a long time, as I know I can talk, but what we have in the lysosomal storage disease world is a real plethora of different treatment modalities. And so we've done clinical trials, or are doing clinical trials in this wide range of different types of therapy at the present time and over the last 10 to 20 years. So that's intravenous infusion of protein replacement therapies. It's then moved to graduate into giving these therapies into the brain by intrathecal routes or intraventricular routes. Then thinking about a long-held collaboration with our bone marrow transplant team here in the hospital, and moving through from standard indications to experimental and gene-modified stem cell transplant work. And we can only get patients to take the risks that some of those trials involved by having long experience doing that in clinic where there's standard. The type of therapy that we've offered has changed dramatically, and we've now offering some oral therapies, but also moving towards advanced therapies. So direct in vivo gene therapies to the central nervous system, RNA-based therapies, and also ex vivo or gene-modified stem cell type therapies. So a whole range of different therapies, which I think we've felt able to do because we've got a strong background in slightly more straightforward clinical trials. Next slide, please. I'm just going to talk quickly about this one particular disease, which illustrates many of the points that we've had. This was a disease commonly known as WOLMAN disease, or a lysosomal disorder where this particular enzyme is deficient. And in babies with the severe form of this disease, they have massive storage of fat and cholesterol in the liver, spleen, and the intestines. So they die. So they present very early with symptoms in the first few weeks of life. Often we only will diagnose them between 2 and 3 months of age, and they're often dead by 3 to 4 months of age of rapidly progressive disease. So a very severe disease that we didn't understand terribly well. And you can see here a couple of the patients that we recruited to our first trial, some of them really profoundly ill. And this is a really rare disease. These guys, this is about a 1 in 500,000 type disorder. So we were trying to get patients to come to us from everywhere, knowing that we had a very small window of opportunity to intervene before the patient on the bottom picture became the patient on the top picture. And that progression from one stage to another occurred often in only 1 or 2 weeks. So if there were delays in shipping a patient here, and when we opened the study, we're the only global site, then we really missed the boat to treat these patients. And so we had to work really, really collaboratively with patient groups, CROs, logistics companies, the sponsor, and academic sites and partners around the world to try and make this work. Next slide, please. The treatment that we were using was an enzyme replacement therapy, so a simple recombinant protein, the protein that's missing in these patients, infused weekly by an intravenous infusion. And the slide or the graph on the left-hand side here, the untreated patients. This is from a retrospective natural history study we did, showing the death rates or the survival of these patients. And as you can see, almost none of these patients with this very severe early onset form of the disease survived greater than 6 months. In the first study, in fact, this graph on the right showing ERT treatment showed the survival curve, from the same sort of population of patients, but those who we've treated in the first 2 infant studies. And you see that survival is at around 2/3 of patients, up to about 4 years, and we've now had patients with this disease surviving with really good quality of life up to 8 or 9 years of age. But the treatments and the trial designs were really complicated. We couldn't have a control group other than a historical control group. Clearly, patients needed to come from other countries, but getting patients from other countries here to our site in Manchester in 1 or 2 weeks was significantly challenging on a number of fronts, and some kids simply couldn't come, and some kids were simply too ill to be able to move. So a really challenging, tricky study. However, what we found was that we could stabilize these patients over 6 to 9 months of treatment. We needed the whole multidisciplinary team to be working here in the hospital to keep these kids alive while the treatment had its effect. But then we were able to open a site once the patient had stabilized close to home, and we then transferred the patient back to a local specialist hospital. And this, in the end, was dramatically successful. And on the basis of the first 9 patients in this study, we were able to get this drug licensed. Hugely complex study with lots of work, and I've become significantly grey in doing this study, but actually really worthwhile in terms of the outcome for families. Next slide, please. Yeah, and just to kind of show a couple of the kids, these kids are profoundly malnourished with liver failure when they come to us. The 2 slides. Well, here we got before and after photographs of some of the babies coming to us on these studies at the very start, and then real proof that they grow up and do well and are neurologically normal and developmentally normal. So a very encouraging study to be part of. Next slide, please. Excellent. So I'll stop here, but I just wanted to give an example of the experience of some really pretty complicated studies, but which required a huge effort on everyone's behalf. And it isn't just about us as a site, it's about the whole team working together. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you, Simon. I wanted to echo what Simon mentioned. As a clinical trial manager and project lead, certainly rare disease studies are very, very, very complex. But there is also on the other side great joy and great accomplishment and a great feeling of deep satisfaction that we have been able to help so many families and continue to do so. And certainly rare disease touches everyone's lives, whether you may know it or not. But yeah, thank you so much, Simon, for those examples. Very helpful. Okay, so just a bit about some logistical items in helping to organize all of these great researchers in ensuring that studies are able to be run effectively and efficiently. As Simon and Liz noted, often studies in rare orphan indications are conducted at large university or academic centers. In many cases, the indication under study is not very well known and takes a lot of logistical coordinating in order to even get to the first step, which is submissions to regulatory authorities and protocol design. We know that in many cases there are complicated contractual agreements, budget review processes, in addition to getting the site up and running. and ready to bring in their first patient. This requires a very high level of study team engagement, including the investigator themselves, who are working very closely with the patients and families, and also between the sponsor, the sites, and the CRO. We require a high level of activity and often require a lower ratio of study team members per site than what we would normally see in a more common indication. So some strategies that we have implemented to support regulatory approvals in the past. One thing that has worked really well is partnering with the investigator beginning from the time of study feasibility. We create a roadmap for each site, especially when there may be just 1 or 2 study centers participating in a trial, creating a roadmap or a schedule of what we anticipate will happen, how approvals will go, when board meetings are planned to occur, and really collecting our team and making sure we as a sponsor and a CRO understand at the site level who is responsible for overseeing submissions and contracting and budgeting. How are we going to keep the investigator included in all of those activities so that they can help move things forward if needed? And really, as Liz mentioned at the beginning, identifying someone at each site to be our study champion, to be the person who tells it like it is, who gives us the real information, and trusting the site when they tell us how long they expect something to take. They know their site processes and their bureaucracies, for lack of a better word. They know them best and they know how to navigate them best. So really partnering with the site staff to ensure that everyone is aware and engaged, and so that we can get over any hiccups quickly. One thing we've also done is schedule checkpoints with study teams to evaluate their progress as we go through the study startup process. Those can be either milestone or time-based. So say we have a meeting every month, or we have a meeting once an IRB approval is received or an IBC approval is granted, so that we can regroup and move on to the next milestone. Some other ways that we've prepared for these and made things go a bit more quickly is to make sure that the sponsor and CRO team have a frequently asked questions document that is shared with the site, so that if the investigator is asked questions or the site staff is asked questions by their internal teams, they're able to answer those quickly and get responses out to their teams that have been pre-approved by the sponsor and don't take days on days for us to get ourselves together and answer a question that might be a bit more complicated. We also try to plan for consent reviews, plan for rounds of revisions. We create negotiation parameters in advance so that the CRO team is empowered to make decisions and move forward during negotiations without every step having to go through several legal reviews on the CRO and the sponsor side. As I mentioned, communication is very critical. Thinking about things like safety monitoring plans, sample storage plans. Often rare disease studies these days are including genetic sampling, which take additional time to get approved, and there are a lot of complex procedures surrounding those. So making sure the team is well aware in advance of who is receiving results, how the samples are planning to be used, where they're going, where they're being stored. If a patient were to withdraw their consent, is there a process for withdrawing those samples so they don't get run or reported? But making sure that these types of study plans and details are thought of in advance of site submissions makes the entire process go more smoothly. It does take a little bit more time to set up on the front end, but really does save time, which is most important when we're trying to get effective therapies out to our patients. Once the trial has begun, obviously startup is not the only time that the sponsor is engaged with the site. We recognize that in an academic environment or a large hospital environment, study coordinators and investigators, their time is sacred. They are spending time with patients. They are working on administrative tasks. They may not be only conducting our study, they may be conducting several different studies, including investigator-initiated studies at the hospital level. So it's really important to ensure that we have strategies in place to help support them and make it as simple as possible for a study team to successfully conduct the protocol. Some ways that we've done that in the past: providing regular study updates or newsletters via email so that study teams don't have to take time out of their day to join a call, or if there is a call, making sure the agenda is well thought out and the objective has been made clear to everyone attending the call in advance. Making sure to work with advocacy groups or your sponsor to share specific and industry-wide scientific developments with sites. Often those of us on the industry side of things hear about and are aware of new developments a little bit sooner, and we can share those with the coordinators so that they can also share with their patients and families. As Liz also mentioned, it's really important to have a strong CRA to CRC connection. So ensuring that the coordinator feels confident that the clinical research associate is able to answer their questions, help provide feedback, help provide suggestions and support. We try our best to make sure that our conversations aren't one-sided, that we're not always asking for information and updates from site staff, but that we're also sharing lessons learned from other sites, lessons learned maybe globally on the trial, or lessons from previous trials that we've seen work well, and really make it a collaborative relationship so that everyone comes away with all of the information they need in order to keep the study moving forward. And then finally, collaborating on critical activities. Really, to sum everything up, the most important thing is thinking about how we can lift the burden off of site staff, off of patients, off of families, off of investigators. We know that clinical trials are very resource heavy. They take a lot of energy, they take a lot of activity, they take a lot of brain power, and they take a lot of logistics. So thinking about ways in advance that we can reduce that burden, whether that's remote chart review to help support enrollment, creating enrollment materials, providing enhanced travel support. As Simon mentioned, many times in rare studies, our patients are very ill and transporting them can be quite challenging. It's not as easy as reimbursing for an Uber. We do require specialized medical travel support and logistics. So really thinking about the target patient population and taking a little bit of a walk in their shoes to understand how they might be best supported. One other item that we talked about in our conversations leading up to this call is really asking sites how can we help them. Oftentimes sponsors assume what would be helpful for sites, and we do a lot of work on things that sites never look at or they get filed away. So really collaborating with the sites on what activities would be most helpful for them, what are they going to need the most support on, and really thinking about things from a site and coordinator and investigator perspective to make things as simple as possible. All right, so with that, I will thank everyone for joining and open it up for questions and answers.
Well, thank you very much for that insightful presentation. Now, I would like to invite our audience members to continue sending their questions or comments right now using the questions window for the Q&A portion of this webinar. Liz, when you're ready, take it away.
Perfect, thank you. Simon, your point was well taken regarding the little things in trials that affect patients and their families. Your example of the family staying in a hotel that did not properly accommodate wheelchairs was quite enlightening. Can you, or Kelly, disclose what patient advocacy groups or travel vendors you've worked with that really help with these arrangements and for what therapeutic areas?
I mean, I could just talk about the UK, but it's the experience we've had. We've worked with a number of patient advocacy organisations. Perhaps the most advanced in some way would be the UK MPS Society, who formed a kind of what they now are calling a rare disease research partnership team, which is a slightly separate and commercial organisation, which is not for profit. but is able to work on a very professional basis, managing the logistics around clinical trials, and they've moved from helping with clinical trials in their direct patient area, like with MPS type or lysosomal patients, to a much broader sort of portfolio, because the skills that are useful for one sort of pediatric rare disease group are often useful for others. So that's the group we've worked with, but we've also worked with other groups where there's a specific patient advocacy group for a particular disease.
Yeah, and I'll second that Medpace has worked with a number of advocacy groups. We often work with travel partners as well to facilitate accommodations for patients directly. And some things to consider when identifying a good travel partner is understanding their availability for 24-hour support, making sure that there's capacity for the travel agents to work in the patient's local language. As Simon mentioned, often patients are traveling across country borders to participate in a clinical trial. So thinking about things like, you know, in one instance, we had to buy winter clothes for a patient and family who were coming from South America to the US in winter, and they didn't have any winter clothes that they would bring with them. So really thinking about patient needs in advance. In terms of patient advocacy partnership, Medpace has partnered with several advocacy groups, including PPMD, to perform webinars, get the word out about the study, and help to disseminate trial results at the end of the trial. So definitely there are good advocacy partners out there, and we are open to using them and having them help us.
Thank you both. Another question that we have is, how has the utilization of remote assessments affected sites during COVID? Is this something that has already been utilized in rare research, or are you utilizing them more at the site level? Simon, from your perspective, are you utilizing more remote assessments during COVID?
We are. Now there are, of course, are challenges with that, but we are, because we've all been forced to and you know, some of that's been really beneficial, and we've realized that some of the visits that we perhaps had were as safety visits were sort of actually we didn't actually need the patient to travel to the site for us to get all the information we needed to. We also have for study visits which have been particularly challenging during COVID, where a patient simply couldn't travel because of specific travel restrictions. We've had to sort of get rapid opening of a local site, of the local clinical team involved with the patient, and got their help in the study. And we found, when dealing with ethics committees and regulators that who govern our trials, that actually they've all been entirely open to that and accept that on a pragmatic basis we need to do what's right for the patient, trying to ensure the integrity of the study as much as possible, but the safety of the patient was paramount. And actually just being really open, transparent, and having honest conversations about the challenges we have through problems like the COVID pandemic has actually allowed everyone to work together, and we've been able to do urgent safety assessments, for example, in a local at a local centre that's not set up as a site, and then get a sort of accelerated setup, so they're essentially a kind of satellite site, so they can perform some of the safety and simple assessments, but the patients will still come back to us for, you know, on a much less frequent basis for some of the really key efficacy assessments.
Yeah, and I think from the CRO perspective, out of tragedy comes innovation, right? So we are seeing more and more innovative remote monitoring devices that are emerging from the COVID, from the pandemic. So like, 12-lead ECGs, as well as other devices that we can utilize remotely that have been CE marked and approved, and can even make the efficiencies going approval through ethics committees even more, even improved. Kelly, I'm not sure if you have anything to add about devices.
Nothing specific about devices, but as Simon mentioned, we have been able to come up with some good creative solutions for getting lab samples from patients who may live far away or may not be able to travel due to the pandemic, setting up remote infusion centers for patients who may need to have weekly infusions of medication or even daily infusions, and setting up their local infusion center as a study center are some ways that we've also been able to adapt during the pandemic to make sure that rare disease research continues.
Wonderful. And I think that's all we have time for. Mira?
Thank you very much for those answers. We've now reached the end of the Q&A session. If we couldn't attend to your questions, the team at Medpace may follow up with you, or if you have any further questions, to direct them to the email address showing on your screens right now. That's info@medpace.com. Thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from XTalks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screens, and your participation is appreciated as it will help us improve our webinars. Now I'm about to send you a link in the chat box. You'll be able to view the recording of this event on this page, and you can also share this with your colleagues when they register for the recording here as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join me in thanking our speakers, and we hope you found this webinar informative. Have a great day, everybody.